Hey all, welcome to today's panel, Politics in Speculative Fiction, Science Fiction, Fantasy. I am not a political person at all, so I have a bit of a hard time including political elements in my novels. So I've got some experts here to help me talk about it. Michael, why don't you start off by telling us about yourself?
Hey guys, I'm Michael. I basically write fantasy. Political stuff is what I'm hopefully good at, so I'm hopefully going to bring some stuff in. It's quite late out tonight on my end because I live in the UK, so everyone else is asleep. I'll try and be quiet.
All right, Erin.
I'm Erin Smith. I'm a novelist. I write horror, sci-fi, and fantasy, and I have political elements in the stories, but I hope the stories tell themselves without getting too bogged down.
Awesome. Amanda.
I think that's part of the...
I'm Amanda Pepper along with A. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. And I write mystery and fantasy, and I have a background in parageography, which is the study of imaginary places and world building. I learned that from Dr. Douglas Parker at the University of Texas at Austin, who coined the phrase parageography and created a very specific world building class and what's the word, curriculum. So that's probably why I'm here.
Awesome. Alicia.
Okay, gang, I'm Alicia Christine. I write mainly fantasy, although some science fiction. And I enjoy exploring all sorts of different elements of cultures and different creatures with basically taking creatures that you've heard of, that you've grown up with, that you know, and that you kind of get tired of, and doing new twists with them.
Nice. Josh.
Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Rutherford. I am a novelist. I write primarily fantasy, although a little bit of science fiction. And I love incorporating politics and religion to no-nos and other spheres, but I love incorporating that in my own writings to make my worlds more realistic.
That's awesome. Actually, that's one of the reasons that this panel I came up with this panel, is because you can't really discuss politics with your friends, you know, and have them remain friends. You know, you've got so many differing opinions, as we're seeing now with the elections and the results. Whereas if you create a fantasy political system or a science fiction political system, you have a way to examine current politics through the lens of a fantasy world. So it's a sort of dissociation where you can keep your friends, but still discuss those hot button issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, in every I'm going to say every fantasy novel that I've read, basically, or in the majority of them, there's going to be a monarchy. That's probably the most cliched political system. It's the easiest one to write. There's a king, there's the queen and the prince and the princess and all of that. Pretty easy. Now, let's put those aside. Forget the monarchy. What is another great political system to have in both science fiction and fantasy worlds? What is your favorite?
Empire is probably my favorite.
Empire, okay.
Empires are fun.
I always think of like a religious caste system where there are priests in charge somehow. So.
And I don't know that you want to throw the monarchy out with the bathwater. The reason that it's so prevalent is because a lot of fantasy is set in a middle economy, and feudalism lends itself to that sort of economy. That's why feudalism was a worldwide practice at the Japanese system with the shogunate to the European kings. So I think it can be well done. Look at Game of Thrones. It's the same sort of system, but it's so detailed and well done that it's not cliche. And there's politics there that are ripe and vibrant.
Definitely. Oh, I'm not saying let's stop writing monarchies. I'm saying let's talk about all the other ones, because everyone can talk about monarchies. It's pretty easy. But like, okay, for example, a dictatorship. You can kind of have a king or an emperor who's a dictator, but is there a more modern form of dictatorship that we can use in a science fiction or a fantasy setting?
Science fiction, certainly. Fantasy, it depends on the fantasy, I think. If you're writing epic fantasy, you're going to be back in that feudalistic sort of world. But, you know, depending on what you're doing, if you're doing urban fantasy, you sure as heck can use any sort of modern dictatorships or socialism or anything else you want to, because they're all part of our world.
That's true.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I would agree with that too, and I think that that would also sci-fi. I think you could even play with even different systems, because that gives you a futuristic view that allows you to have different economies and play with it, or have different groups of actors and show comparison and contrast.
But yeah, I mean, you look at something like Dune, or you even look at Star Wars, where you've got this very complicated system of, you know, trade agreements, where people are like, we don't really want to watch a movie about trade agreements. But the bottom line of Star Wars is people trying to overthrow a government, and there being a lot of other worlds involved in the complications for that. So it happens in sci-fi, I think, quite a lot.
I mean, obviously,
Absolutely.
you can combine the all the political, all kinds of political governments together, can't you? I mean, most of the time you're going to combine feudalism with monarchy,
Right.
because a lot of the time in medieval fantasy, it's set in medieval times. So you obviously, a lot of people do combine that together, and at the same time you can combine that with like despotism or dictatorship. Because a lot of fantasy novels are about mad, evil, cruel kings. So it is a cliche, but it's one which is quite easy to write, which is probably the reason why it's cliche, so to speak. But you can blend different versions together, really.
That's true. Now here's a question. How much politics? Like, you can write political thrillers, you can write political mysteries, you can write very politically heavy fantasy novels. Like, take Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight. There's all the actions, but at its heart, there's a very heavy political element where there's the different houses trying to vie for power. He pulls it off. Game of Thrones pulls it off. There's a lot of fantasy novels and science fiction novels that just don't do it right. So how do you incorporate elements of politics without getting into, as Amanda was saying, boring stuff?
Well, I mean, no, sorry. No, go ahead. Who was talking? Oh, well, I was just going to say, I think it has to do with, is the story at its heart political? Like with Game of Thrones, it's a political story. That's the story. But a lot of people who write science fiction, maybe their story isn't political, but they get really excited by this world they've built, and they want to show everything they've done, all this hard work they've done, and it's not actually necessary to the story, and then it bogs things down. And so you need to decide at the heart of your story what your story is from the outset. You need to know the political stuff when you're writing regardless, but you need to figure out how much to put in based on what the story really is.
Absolutely.
I agree. And part of it is
That pretty much basically just, that was basically what I was going to say, really. But it honestly does depend on what the plot entails, really. If you're gonna have a novel like based on, well, I'm gonna say out loud, the politics of it, obviously you're gonna have a lot of focus on the politics. I mean, for example, if you're gonna have war, like civil war, which is a very popular plot point for novels, you're gonna probably focus an awful lot on the politics, because you'll probably have to go into why is the country or so at war, who is backing who, and then who's supporting each side, and a lot of the time that's got to be to do with politics.
And I think it has to be organic to the story. Game of Thrones has come up a lot because it's civil war. But take Terri Goodkind's Wizard First Rule series. The first few books were very strong But then, kind of towards the mid and end of the season, his books just became Anne Rain set in a fantasy background, and they started getting unreadable because, okay, we get it. You're going to give a 5-page speech on your political system. That's not what readers are there for, and it takes away from the strength of the story.
Absolutely, because if you're going to deal with politics or religion or any sort of world building that you're doing in your story, you can't overshadow the characters, because the readers are there for the characters. They're there to see what the characters do, what makes them tick, how they react to the plot. And if you take the plot and overshadow the characters, then you've lost the point.
To Alicia's point, I believe politics and fantasy and sci-fi has to be additive to the plot or the story, and creates an element that we as the audience can really get into and we're not turned off by, because typically politics in the real world puts off everybody. No one really wants to deal with it. They just kind of put it aside on the bookshelf and then turn their backs on it. And fantasy and sci-fi allows us to take a glimpse at ourselves and to really analyze what's going wrong or right in our own society via a medieval world or another fantasy world or science fiction. And it creates really interesting elements that we can dissect without having to take too much of a look at ourselves.
Now let me ask you guys this. As
Awesome.
people who write politics in their fantasy or science fiction, how often do you find your personal political views, sort of like your religious views, how often do you find them sliding into the world unintentionally or intentionally?
Depends on what character I'm writing. There are certain characters that I consider to be almost mouthpieces of mine that, for good or ill. And if I'm writing from that character's perspective, then they're going to be really, really close to what I think and what I view things as far as my worldview is concerned. But there are other characters that think completely different than I do. And I don't always succeed, but I try to give a fair view from each point of view of each particular character.
I agree, and I think the characters that disagree with me are kind of the more fun ones to write, because I have to think to get into their heads, and it's a good exercise to make sure they're not one-dimensional. Star Wars could have been even a little bit more fun had the evil empire not just been an evil empire that we knew was evil, but look at it from their point of view. From their point of view, they're fighting an insurgency that I'm sure has done its own share of damage, and that could have been a really interesting dynamic to look at. But it was pretty easy and heavy-handed once the main bad guy was named Dark Father for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, I think with a name like that, I think it kind of implies that he's evil.
But wouldn't that be fun?
I'm gonna be
so much fun to like flip it around and have Dark Father, as like the main character, and his dictatorship is like the best for society, and then the monarch or the hero comes and just totally screws things up. That could be a really fun story to write.
Yeah,
that'd be quite funny actually. On the topic, I'm gonna be a bit controversial. I try not to let my political feelings go in no matter what I write, because I think one of the biggest pitfalls a writer can make is try and preach to their readers through their characters, because then you just turn into message fantasy and it's like, okay, we're just trying to shove our opinions down their throats now. People just aren't going to like that.
Yeah, and
if you make it obvious.
Yeah, people are very savvy. They can tell when they're being talked at as opposed to being told a story. I honestly believe that. So actively, probably subconsciously it's in there, but I don't actively try to, give an opinion one way or another.
I agree. I think keeping it fair and balanced doesn't make it more interesting. But Michael Jordan said, Republicans buy a lot of shoes. And so he was very careful. Is generally politics, half of your readership's probably going to disagree with one view or another. And so not only is making sure that the way you treat a philosophy in terms of developing the counter philosophy and making sure that you're giving it a balanced approach adds depth and nuance to the story, but probably also helps from a marketing perspective too. And since we're all hoping to get paid for this, that's something we got to take into consideration. I think Larry Correia is very outspoken in his politics, and I've heard that he's had a hit in his sales because of that.
Really?
One of the best resources I've come across as a fantasy or sci-fi writer when writing politics, either from the perspective of a protagonist or antagonist, and perhaps some of you have seen this. It's a video that went viral during the summer, and it was of a CIA operative, and she was talking about how during the course of her work, when she was interviewing ISIS fighters or the Taliban, she was talking how, from their point of view, they consider themselves the good guys. And she went into one example about how we put out all these science fiction and fantasy movies, for instance, Independence Day or Star Wars. And in those cases, it's about a scrappy band of rebels versus this technologically advanced empire. And the Taliban, the ISIS, regardless of how you feel about them, they consider themselves the scrappy band of rebels taking on an empire, unfortunately, in our case, the United States or Western powers. And I thought it was very interesting in that no one, kind of in the scope of the world that we live in, considers themselves the bad guys. The Republicans don't consider themselves the bad guys. Democrats don't consider themselves the bad guys. This election turned all of that on its head, and we find a way, and by we, I mean humans in general, to really just reason with ourselves to convince ourselves that what we're doing is right, whether we're a tyrant, whether we believe in socialism, democracy, a republic. And I try to implement that same element into all my characters, whether they are the bad guys or the good guys.
Absolutely. Because that makes characters so much more rich. I mean, every villain is a hero in his own mind. It's absolutely true. And it's really fun whenever you get to explore those characters and explore what makes them tick and find out just why they think that they are the hero, even if they are cast as the villain in your story.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Now, should every story include politics? Yes or no? I know there are certain political elements to just about every story, but have you read, can you think of any great stories that had no politics whatsoever?
Are you talking politics on the macro level or politics on the micro level? Because anytime you get a group of people together, there's going to be group dynamics in politics. Even if it's just a small group questing across the land, there's going to have to be figuring out who's the leader, how things get done. So there's politics at that level, or there's politics at the nation state grander level there, and that you may not always need.
Interesting.
I think it depends on what you're doing.
Expound on that one.
Anybody else got anything?
Yeah.
It's
Sorry.
very, yeah. Basically, yeah, it just depends on what you're going to be writing. I mean, if you're going to be writing fantasy or sci-fi, I think you do need I think you're going to need like the most basic level of politics for most story cases, like just as Erin said about you want to know who's in charge. But if it's going to be a story which doesn't focus on that, you can be very, very liberal on how much detail you need. If you're doing like a Game of Thrones style thing, then you're going to have to lay in thick on the politics. So
I think oh, go ahead.
You go ahead, it's fine. I've finished.
Oh, I was just going to add to what you were saying in that I think it depends largely on how much you invest in world building in your story within a fantasy or science fiction. If you were doing a short story where that is very minimal in what you're trying to say, then you could probably skirt by with very little or no mention of politics, or have very little politics influence how your characters or the rest of your story plays out. However, if you are writing a very thick novel, 500, 600, 700 pages or more, and you find yourself with a world that is very imposing on the characters in the story, I can't imagine any writer who can avoid politics at that point.
That's true. One thing that I find interesting about the Game of Thrones series is that it's very political, but it's not like they give you a lot of backstory or a lot of info dumps on the politics. You don't find out until later on where the enmity between the different houses are, or why House Stark is so close to House Baratheon, or like there's so much about it that you discover through the interactions between the characters, or this off-the-wall comment, or the occasional thing that you just don't.
Are we talking about the show or the books? Because the books take it a lot deeper.
Yeah, they get like paragraphs of the political relationships. I don't remember that. I just remember the characters interacting. And of course, there is some.
Both of them are done very well.
Okay.
Both of them, they're done very well. But the book goes into it with so much more depth, which is why, in my opinion, that it's better. I'm not gonna go into why I'm not very keen on Game of Thrones now. That could be for another time. But
that's interesting. All right.
This isn't a discussion about how bad I think Game of Thrones is. So,
I mean, when I'm reading a book, sometimes the politics I just kind of skip over them because they can be so involved that it doesn't serve the story in some way, and so it's just like, well, whatever, If this guy shows up later trying to kill my main character, well, then he's a villain. If he's trying to help my main character, he's not a villain. Like sometimes. But then there are books that just feed you enough that it sets up the story, or they do it in small bites at a time. Chapter 1, they give you this hint about the political intrigue. Chapter 2, they give you a bit more of a look at one character. So I think it's about doing it in bits and pieces that you eventually cobble together this big world with the whole complex political system, but without saying, here is a 500-page manuscript of the politics of this world, because that would be super boring.
Yeah, it would.
Well,
You're talking about the difference between info dumping and writing well. I mean, that's really what you're talking about there. I mean, I reread Dune recently with my 10-year-old son because he was curious. And we had to stop every 5 minutes because he was like, wait, I don't understand. What's the Spice Guild and why are they this way? And what are the Bene Gesserits trying to do? And I'm like, well, it's kind of, I'm going, it's complicated, even for me now. And I remember reading it when I was his age, and none of that really mattered to me. Like, I understood that the Harkonnens and the Atreides were enemies and the Emperor was doing something underhanded, but I didn't need to know the detail that Frank Herbert put into it at the time. Reading it now, I'm like, wow, this guy did a serious amount of work building this world and this system. But I think at different ages too, you read at a different level. And I was surprised. I looked at Dune and I said, wow, today I'm not sure this would have been published.
Yeah, I think the standard has been raised very high, considering the stuff that was published 50, 70, 100 years ago. And then, like if Conan had been published in 2010, the guy would have just been shot to shit because it's such a patriarchal or a sexist story. And so like things have totally changed. And so I guess it's about adapting your writing, your fiction to the latest trends. Or,
Well, that people just have a lot thinner skins, it seems.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd have to agree.
Which is really unfortunate. So
Yeah.
And I was going to say the danger in adopting to the latest trends is the trends can
move
turn on
very
you.
fast. Yep.
When S.E. Hinton gets screamed at for interpreting her own book, we've stepped through the looking glass.
Yeah. Yeah, we absolutely have.
Well, I don't even know if it's trends so much as I think people's attention span has shortened quite a bit. And you start developing something really deep and complicated, and they kind of go, ugh, and they toss the book aside because they're like, I don't have time for this. I don't have the energy for this. I want something escapist, and I want something that moves really quickly. And you're laying these layers. Now, I know there's a certain sect of readers who are like, no, give me the good stuff, go deep and, rooted. But I think broadly, when we're talking massive sales, people want relatively throwaway, quick read type things. I've just noticed this with my own sales, that the things that I spend the most time on don't sell as well as the stuff that I, kind of tossed off almost. Not, and I think that has to do with the way readers are reading these days.
I'd have to agree. And there was I don't know how recent it was, but there was somebody had asked Terri Brooks about that, and he made the notion, he sat there and talked about Shannara and the fact that the first Shannara book was one that had this really nice, elegant, long flowing intro, and he told the interviewer, I would never write that today because it's not fast enough to pick up readers today. And it's just, our culture has gone far more towards give it to me quick, give it to me in chunks, and go down the road. And that's very difficult. That's a difficult line to straddle, especially when we're trying to talk about things like religion, like politics, like all of this deep thinking stuff, and try to balance that. It's very difficult.
I agree. Giving the short version when it comes to politics and religion is difficult enough. And then when you add to that trying to build that into your fantasy world or your science fiction world, it's nearly impossible. And I think the best writers within fantasy and science fiction are able to do that, offer you little snippets of their political reality or their religious reality for their characters, while also having this undercurrent, this backstory that they don't necessarily have to spell out. If I were to write a scene about turning on a television or a flat screen and all of a sudden Donald Trump is blaring this very controversial rhetoric, that would provide me instantaneously with a sense of where I am in my own world without having to go into too much backstory. So that's just one current example, which I know all of us can relate to.
That's true. That's actually a really good way to emphasize the political, is just sort of have sort of like let's say you're trying to write a dictator. You don't actually have the guy think about the politics. You just have him give a speech and have him sound like Hitler, and right there you've set up a very clear dictatorship without getting into the politics or the backstory. And so you can layer it in. You have to be clever. You have to write well.
Yeah.
But it can be done. Very good. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for participating and sharing your wisdom. I feel so much more political savvy now.
Thank you.
Yay. Thank you very much for having us.
Yes,
Thank you, Andy. Appreciate it.
All right. And if you guys want to find out more about these awesome authors who joined into the panel, check out the links below. Enjoy.